Alireza Firouzja had an excellent Norway chess tournament. He came second overall, and I don't want him to just be remembered for this terrible loss against Carlsen, where he was clearly very nervous. I want to take you back to round one and show you his game against Duda. So Firouzja with the black pieces here. Interesting to see him playing the Caro-Kann as one of his main openings. So it's nice to have variety. You know, he's not just playing e4, e5 or e4, c5, as is the fashion amongst the top players. So knight c3. It's the old main line with bishop f5. It looks as though black's setup is very modest indeed, but there is hidden energy behind this setup along the third rank, basically. So we're following the main line of this opening, and the fashion, let's say in the 50s, 60s, and even later, was to castle queenside here, to play with queen c7 and castles queenside. But Firouzja plays in a more aggressive way, castling kingside. And of course, with kings on opposite sides of the board, then you're much more likely to get a sharp struggle because, you know, white will try to attack on the king side, often with that g pawn, and black often attacks on the queen side. I dabbled with this system with black long time ago. Wasn't my major opening, but I used to enjoy these kind of positions. And yeah, I think you have to be very careful about this g4, g5 advance. But I always liked the fact that black was breaking in the middle very quickly. So what you have to do is basically distract white, embroil white in complications in the middle and on the queen side before white has a chance to play g4, g5. Having said that, it is actually possible to advance with g4 in this position. It's a pawn sacrifice, and well, it's a crazy position, but that's pretty well analysed by at least the top players, and it seems like black is holding, but you know, that's the sharpest way for white to play the position. But Duda seemed a little bit unsure of himself. I know it was the first round. He thought for 22 minutes over bishop e3, and Firouzja continued to play his moves extremely quickly. This is obviously one of his great strengths. He's extremely well prepared. And Duda, still unsure, he thought for almost 14 minutes over queen takes b7. He picked up the gauntlet and plunged in and took the pawn. Thing is, if the queen just drops back, in fact, black is actually fine here. One of the problems is that after this, let me just digress for a moment here, that in these kind of situations, although it might appear that the game is quite level, in fact, white has a problem here because that h-pawn is attacked. And yeah, basically the rook is tied to defending that pawn. Black is already more comfortable in this position. So I can understand why Duda took the plunge, took the pawn, but oh, this is quite a scary position. Knight d5, that knight swinging over to the queen side. Queen a6, the queen ducks out, and rook b8. That was Firouzja's first big think of the game, rook b8. So he was obviously just remembering his lines. Very often players will know that the line should be okay for them, and then they have to just figure out why. And well, it's sensible to take the time and get the move right. So rook b8 threatens a nice check on c3, therefore bishop d2. And another big think from Firouzja, almost 20 minutes over pawn takes pawn. In fact, the players are following an old game. Bishop f6. Already this looks absolutely terrifying for white, with the bishop and the rook trained on the b2 pawn. Well, I mean, I think already one could say this opening has been a success for black. This looks just great fun for black already. It's the kind of position that, you know, on a good day you can get in variations of the Najdorf Sicilian, actually, where the queen side opens up. So knight b3 looks sensible to block the b file. And now queen c7, good move. Connecting the rooks, we like that. Preparing to swing rook number 2 over. I mean, for one pawn, this is a dream position, it has to be said. All black's pieces active. Rook e1. Rook c8, threatening queen takes c2. Rook c1 defending. Now, how does black make progress here? Knight b6 is an excellent move. That knight was good on d5. It's going to be even better once it reaches c4. Rook e4. In fact, this has all been played before. Here, in the game between Beliavsky and Gimeshi, bled 2002, Gimeshi played queen c6 and won a very complicated game. But my computer tells me that the approved move here is knight c4. There we go, computer approved. It does look like a very natural move. I just think it's interesting that Firouzja is playing the computer move, and I'm sure that he would have had this in his preparation. I'm sure he knew of that previous game. He works hard at his chess. Hard work is a talent. So knight c4, hitting all kinds of juicy things, but mainly b2. And looking at that bishop as well, of course. So in fact, rook takes knight, knight takes bishop. All these things are threatened. Therefore, bishop f4, attacking the queen. Naturally, we don't want to close off the diagonal. Queen b6 after almost 14 minutes thought. So offering the exchange of queens. Very interesting. Queens exchanged. Well, there you go. I've put lots of paint on the board. You can see every single one of black's pieces still active. The knight and bishop attacking the b2 pawn. The rooks still look great. And that a pawn is about to become a very useful member of the team, advancing up the board. Once that knight goes, then black will crash through. So even though the queens are exchanged, in fact, black still has such a powerful initiative here. Bishop e3 attacks the rook. Rook b4, and that threatens a nice discovered check. And rook takes rook. f3 defends the rook, and there we go. Pawn to a5. Two things. It defends the rook, so now knight takes b2 is actually a threat. And of course, we would like to play a4 to attack the knight. If a3, then the rook will simply go back, and b2 still attacked, a4 coming as well. Looks great for black. So Duda felt compelled to give up rook for knight. Rook takes. So what's going on here? Well, white has a knight and a pawn for the exchange. But it should be winning for black, this, because, I mean, white's asset here is really these queenside pawns, but they're not going anywhere for the moment. Bishop d2, but it's still complicated. Attacking the rook, rook b5, and bishop takes a5. And rook takes h5. So it's still only one pawn for white. Knight and a pawn against the rook. But now there are 3 connected passed pawns. So it's unbalanced. Still should be winning for black. Rook g1. Played by Duda. Well, here is where I think perhaps Firouzja plays incorrectly. Perhaps you'd like to think, how would you play here with black? And I think this maybe highlights that Firouzja's technique could be better. I think we certainly saw that against Carlsen. We know how brilliant he is with the initiative. Here, I think the best move is to play rook h4, simply with the idea of exchanging rooks. When you're the exchange up, exchanging rooks is usually a good idea. Now, I know this is a special situation where it's unbalanced. If those pawns get rolling, it's problematic. But still, it looks like the principal decision to go for an exchange of rooks, because then this pawn will be vulnerable and the h-pawn will fly. Instead, Firouzja played rook b5. So he's wanting just to keep white's pieces tied up. And if they're tied up, then these pawns won't advance. But now it's actually not so clear. But I can understand why he did it. He wanted to buy himself some time so that he could advance his kingside pawns. But it starts to get a bit messy now. g4. Knight c1. So Duda just arranging for that knight to come round to get out of the way of those pawns, and then it'll be white's turn. And here, really, Firouzja should exchange and play king h7. Perhaps put that rook on h2 and just advance that pawn. Still looks good for black, but it's getting complicated now. Firouzja played g3. Well, that's a really tricky move. Is it a good move? Probably not, though. b3, rook c8, a4. Now those pawns are travelling. Rook f5, knight e2. Attacking the pawn, h4. c4, white pawns edging forward. And here my computer wants black to play king f8 and to bring the king over, but certainly not an obvious move. Firouzja continues with his actually very straightforward plan of advancing his kingside pawns. Bishop e3, bishop g5 after a long think. Bishop takes bishop, rook takes bishop, rook h1. Attacking the pawn, which is defended. King c3, f5. Wow, we've got a race on our hands here. b4, f4. So now black has 2 pawn breaks. That's how Firouzja wants to try to decide the game, just by pushing these pawns. He's just going straight ahead and not worrying about white's pawns. Now Duda played a5 here. And that was a mistake. He should have played the unlikely looking knight g1 to prevent the h-pawn rolling. And now it's not so clear. Obviously, given a moment, then white just wants to push those pawns. And if Firouzja continues like this, then it's actually not so clear. f3, that can just be taken. Rook e8, a5, a6. White has decent counterplay here. I know it looks absolutely mad to put the pieces like this. I have a feeling that Duda probably just thought, it looks too unlikely for knight g1 to be any good. Anyway, he played a5, and now h3 was actually very powerful. Just by playing with a forward gear, Firouzja finally makes the decisive breakthrough. Rook takes h3, and now f3 is winning. Those pawns make it over the line. So well, he didn't play pawn takes, allowing rook takes pawn check, and then rook takes. Instead, king f4 is a good move. And now this one is, of course, a threat. Knight f4 and f2 was the final move of the game. Duda resigned. If knight takes rook, then f1 queen. And the queen and rook in combination will finish off white's king very well. So, yeah, I think we show, we see what Firouzja is about in that game very well. Superb with the initiative. That came out of the opening and somehow persisted right through into the endgame. But even though technically I think he was lacking a bit, should have exchanged rooks in that endgame, even so, he kind of barreled through with this amazing initiative that carried through right till the end. But yeah, brilliant with the initiative. Technically could do better. We saw that against Carlsen, of course. And he has great opening preparation. So the initiative and opening preparation, those are the things, and great tactical skill, has to be said. Those are the things that are carrying Alireza Firouzja at the moment. And with this tournament success, he moves up to number 17 in the world rankings. Not bad for a 17-year-old. There's plenty more from him to come, no doubt. Thanks for watching.